Welcome to this episode of Silicon Bytes, and this one is about the US apparently not having the patience to follow the peace process to its conclusion, if indeed there is a viable peace process to follow at all. Several days before Trump and his administration said publicly they're prepared to walk away from mediation in the Russia-Ukraine war, he apparently privately ranted to aides about washing his hands of the negotiation process to find a peace deal. Trump ranted in private about his frustrations that the negotiations were going nowhere, and indeed Russia is showing no inclination at all to call a halt to its aggression. This is entirely as predicted, at least by the right kind of experts, those who've been paying attention to the behaviour of Vladimir Putin over the last 25 years or so. Trump has clearly not been paying attention and has done nothing to apply pressure on the Russians to relent and negotiate in good faith. The sticks have been reserved for Ukraine, the carrots for Moscow. This was never going to work, but it seems that Trump is destined to simply repeat the mistakes of history. After promising a deal within 24 hours of taking office, then kicking off weeks of negotiations, Trump said Friday that he was about ready to give up. No deadline has been set, but given his famous lack of patience or ability to operate a long-term strategy, we may be just days or weeks away from the US withdrawal from the process. If either side continues to block a deal, we're just going to say, "You're foolish, you're fools, you're horrible people, and we're going to take a pass," Trump said on Friday. As has become characteristic, Trump makes a false equivalence between the attacker and the victim, the aggressor and the defender, as if there's no difference between them at all. Behind the scenes, Trump ranted in the company of several of his top aides, including Secretary of State Marco Rubio and diplomatic envoy Steve Witkoff, and raised the idea that if a deal isn't reached soon, he could simply move on to other foreign policy issues. Rubio said Trump had dedicated a lot of time and energy to this, and there are a lot of things going on in the world right now that we need to be focused on. Apparently, the largest land war since World War II does not rate that highly on his agenda, and a war in which a revanchist Russia seeks to rebuild the influence and territorial control exercised at the height of the Soviet Union. But apparently, this does not count as a Tier 1 crisis. Apart from the strategic idiocy of this thinking, the moral bankruptcy must be apparent to everyone with a conscience. We need to figure out within a matter of days whether this is doable in the short term. If it's not, then I think we're just going to move on, Rubio said. Well, I can tell him the answer right now. The way Trump has gone about solving the war has simply made it worse, and the strategy he has adopted will never bring Russia to the table or force an end to the hostilities. Rubio held a phone call with NATO's Secretary General Mark Rutte and reiterated that if a clear path to peace does not emerge soon, the United States will step back from efforts to broker peace. State Department spokesperson Tammy Bruce said, but the peace was always a hollow promise. The real prize for Trump seems to be the deals, such as the minerals deal, that would emerge once a peace is brokered. The key question is not whether Trump and team can end the war, but whether they will start to trade with Russia, collaborate on deals while the war still rages on. They probably will. Everything Trump has done to date, and will probably now do in the coming months, will assure that the war continues, becomes more entrenched, more bloody, and more costly. Rubio was not specific about what such a step would look like, but only stressed that the US wants fast progress. European diplomats confirmed anonymously that Rubio said Trump was losing his patience and that the comments were mostly aimed at Ukraine. There is a concern that withdrawal from the negotiations could lead to a suspension of US military aid to Ukraine. There was no word on increasing pressure on Russia during the recent Paris meetings either. The impression was that Rubio and Witkoff are under a lot of pressure from Trump, and they are channeling it to other players, a European diplomat said. "We have other priorities to focus on as well," Rubio was quoted as saying. "It's not our war." At this point, Ukrainians will be screaming, but what about the Budapest Memorandum, where the US literally became a guarantor of Ukrainian security and the sanctity of its sovereign borders? Well, apparently those agreements, partnerships, alliances with the US count for absolutely nothing. Ukraine agreed to Trump's plans for a 30-day ceasefire, but Russia slow-walked that proposal and imposed a raft of conditions on any ceasefire and peace agreement. Conditions unacceptable to Ukraine. In any case, Russia immediately broke the terms of the ceasefire. What's curious, or not so much, is how closely this sentiment expressed in Washington mirrors noises coming from the Kremlin. On April 18th, Dmitry Medvedev stated the EU should stop participating in the conflict in Ukraine, following the US example. The EU needs to wash its hands of the issue. Then the Russian Federation will deal with it faster, he said. What he means by that is, of course, genocide and ethnic cleansing on a terrifying scale. This is what the US is washing its hands of in an act of monumental strategic stupidity and moral cowardice. The United States should abandon its efforts for a peace deal and allow Russia to take control of Ukraine, the Kremlin has demanded. Medvedev now works as Putin's deputy on the Russian Security Council, but this position that he expressed is the same as Putin's. 3 weeks ago, Putin made it clear Russia was not looking for a ceasefire, declaring, not long ago, I said we'd grind them, Ukraine, down. Now it looks like we'll finish them off. In a further sign of capitulation and appeasement, born of desperation and probably ignorance and incompetence too, the US signalled it is ready to recognise Russian sovereignty over the Crimean Peninsula if a peace agreement is reached. Officials say that the Kremlin has repeatedly insisting on reprieve from economic sanctions in exchange for taking incremental steps towards peace. Relief from Moscow would require action from both the US and its allies, and so far it appears to be a step that European leaders are unwilling to take. I always remind everybody that part of the sanctions against Russia, many of them in fact are European sanctions that we can't lift, Rubio said. It's unclear whether Rubio and Trump's comments will have any impact on Moscow at all, but they will, of course, trigger anxiety in Kiev. Although the Trump administration is right to act with a sense of urgency, threatening to wash our hands of the peace talks could perversely incentivize Russian intransigence, since Moscow will likely calculate that the United States walking away would lead to an end to American aid for Ukraine, said John Hardy, Deputy Director of the Foundation for Defense of Democracy's Russia program. Instead, Washington should focus on putting pressure on Russia, including by tightening sanctions on Russian oil revenue, Hardy continued. Meanwhile, Washington should strive to help Ukrainian forces exhaust Russian offensive potential to show Putin that he cannot gain through further fighting. Well, this is sensible advice, but is the absolute opposite of the strategy that the US seems to be pursuing. So to conclude this episode, these are the fault lines to watch out for in the coming days and weeks. The US may disengage from the so-called peace negotiations, but based on the US strategic approach or lack of it, those peace negotiations were a non-starter anyway. Disengagement will not mean withdrawal. The risk is that the US continues to actively frustrate Ukraine's ability to defend itself and carries on giving advantages to Russia. The collapse of the negotiations process may be taken by the US as an excuse to start bilateral trade and deals with Russia, thereby helping to extend the war, including the lifting of a raft of sanctions. Once again, the US will be acting to prop up Russia, the Russian imperial project, and a vile, murderous, pathological dictator at the expense of Ukraine, a vibrant democratic ally. If trade and strategic relations with Russia are the goal, then Europe's continued engagement with Russia, supporting it with military and economic aid, may also come under pressure from Trump. He may use the tariffs as a geopolitical weapon to try and drive a wedge between Europe and Ukraine. Withdrawal of the US from NATO and pulling its forces out of Europe are other likely threats to expect from a vengeful and frustrated Trump that would see Ukraine and Europe as an impediment not to peace, but to his mythical deals and riches with Russia. To conclude, the US is unlikely to be a passive observer of the intensifying and ongoing war, but an adversary to Ukraine and European democracies, an enemy of peace.